Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the sixth instalment of the Green Adelaide seminar series. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting this afternoon's session with Professor Chris Daniels, the presiding member of the Green Adelaide Board. Today, Chris is going to be talking to us about rewilding, what, when, where and how. So I acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to Kaurna elders, past and present, and acknowledge the deep and continuing connection to country that the Kaurna people have. Mani na pudni, nai nari nat, mani naglu tumpanthi, naglu Kaurna yatanga imprenthi. That was my attempt at saying hi. It's great that you came today. It's great that you're joining us. My name is Nat, and it's really good that we acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna country. So these seminar series are an opportunity for us to be able to share the work that we're doing at Green Adelaide and the work of our stakeholders and partners and communities. I hope that you've been following us along for these. If you've missed any of them, they are recorded and we are recording today's session and you can access those from our YouTube channel. And I'll send you links to those early next week with a recording of today's session. So the way that today will work, we'll hear from Chris for about 40 minutes. Sorry, I forgot my slides there. We'll hear from Chris for about 40 minutes and there will be some time for questions at the end. So at any stage throughout the session, please pop your questions into the chat function. I'll keep an eye on those and we'll get through as many of them as we can at the end. So I'd like to introduce Chris. And I'll look at my notes here. So as I said, Professor Chris Daniels is the presiding member of the Green Adelaide Board. He has been, and I think is an incredible force in popularising nature education in South Australia and has presented on ABC Radio for 2 decades. He started with fortnightly backyard wildlife segments in 2003 and since 2007 has presented many community programs on urban environmental science. Whilst his primary area of interest is in citizen science and eco-literacy, Chris also works with a large number of allied education delivery organisations, including the Marine Discovery Centre, Cleland Wildlife Park, the SA Museum, the Junior Field Naturalists and Nature Play. So I'm absolutely pleased to hand over to Chris, who's going to spend the next 40 minutes discussing rewilding in the context of a multidisciplinary, interactive and interdisciplinary approach to saving species and ecosystems in the 21st century. You'll hear about Green Adelaide's work in this space, including a bold new plan to bring platypus back to Adelaide. All right, over to you, Chris. I will give you the floor. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm absolutely personally really excited to hear what you have to share with us today. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Nat. And firstly, a big thank to Nat and to Amy and to the whole team here for bringing this amazing and exciting seminar series to you. And it really is an opportunity to showcase the amazing stuff that Green Adelaide in particular and the Department for Environment and Water are doing in our space to conserve, preserve and rejuvenate, reinvigorate our natural ecosystems. So I'm really thrilled both to be part of Green Adelaide, of course, but also to be able to talk to you directly about rewilding and what that means. And rewilding is one of those terms, a bit like sustainability or biodiversity, that have become to mean so much that we kind of get a bit confused about what do they actually mean, where did it come from, and how does it apply to what we're doing in recovering ecosystems that are challenged or have become degraded. So we're going to take a cook's tour, if you like, through the whole process of rewilding and to see where that it might take us with the future conservation efforts. So as I said, rewilding is a really important part of understanding our recovery for our biodiversity. And we know that biodiversity is another one of those terms that mean everything and nothing, really. It means the numbers and variety of life at prescribed scale, measurable at numerous levels, including genetic, species, and ecosystem. So biodiversity is an incredibly broad term. What is important about biodiversity is that it means so much for our personal benefit. So if we look at this long list, we could start at the bottom and actually go, biodiversity gives us economic benefit through ecotourism. It gives us our medicines. It gives us our food that enables us to exist on this planet. But biodiversity means so much more than that. And the top 2 points in this tree really illustrate the importance of biodiversity to the function of the planet. So biodiversity provides stability for ecosystems. The broader, the more diverse, the more interactive we have between species from the 5 kingdoms, the greater capacity we have to deliver really high quality ecosystems and ecosystem services. So ecosystem services means really good air, water, and soil. And they're the fundamental elements that we need to exist on this planet. Biodiversity also provides us with resilience against challenge. And we know just recently how savage many of the challenges have been to us through floods and fire and sea floods, climate change, high winds. All of these things can contribute to potential disasters. If you have strong, diverse, and vibrant biodiversity, then recovery from those challenges can be swift and sure. And we are really only understanding now that simple systems are very difficult to recover. Complex biodiversity-rich systems enable us to recover really quickly. So biodiversity is incredibly important for the planet. It's important for us existing on this planet, and it's important for delivering a lot of really important benefits, direct and indirect. So I'm a biological scientist, and I know quite a large number of you out there are too, and we tend to be fairly miserable and rather black about the potential future of the planet, considering the disappearance of biodiversity. So we do tend to walk around feeling kind of miserable, and you can summarize the challenges that we all face to preserving biodiversity in the next 4 slides. The first is population growth is increasing spectacularly. When my father was born in 1932, there were just over 2 billion people on the planet. When I was born in 1960, there were 3.6 billion people on the planet. So about 1.5 billion people were added in the 30 years or thereabouts in that span. When I hit 50, we hit 7 billion people. We're now passing 8 billion. And if I make it to 90 years of age, we will hit 11 billion people. So this enormous growth in human population, in percentages and in absolute numbers, means that the pressure on the planet is extraordinary. And we know that because we know of the increase in the amount of pollutions, the desertification of the planet, the continuing challenges that we see. And therefore, this is matched with the extinctions. And the green line on this graph shows the number of species that have gone extinct, particularly since about the 1960s. And that number is really increasing. So we're undergoing a significant extinction crisis. But it's even more of a problem than that. We are also undergoing a decline in the number of animals that are remaining on the planet still in existence. So World Wildlife Fund conducted a study on some 4,000 species of animals that in 1970 had at least 20,000 individuals in them. So these included the big herd animals like wildebeest, white-tailed deer, and so forth. And they tracked the decline in numbers of animals in these big populations from there to 2016. And what they have shown is that there's been a 68% decrease in the number of individuals within those populations. So not only are we losing species, we're losing large numbers of the species that are often quite common still remaining. So we call this the extinction cliff. So where there were 20,000, now there might be 8,000. For species where there are 8,000, we might be down to 3,000. If there was 1,000, we're down to 200 and so forth. So we expect that line for species extinction to accelerate dramatically in the very near future. But it's going to be replaced by other animals. And if you look at the biomass of life on Earth, it's actually increased enormously. This work by Paul Chafuka and colleagues there show the mass of meat on the planet. So they determined that back 10,000 years before the current era, there were some 200 million tons of meat roaming the planet. And they were almost exclusively wild animals. So they could then determine, they measured carbon in meat and were able to calculate the mass amount there. By the time they got to 1900, this 200 million tons of meat has fallen to about 20 million tons. But it's been replaced by a large amount of domestic animals. So the blue are domestics, particularly sheep, goats, and cattle, but also it includes chickens and pigs, horses, dogs, cats, and so forth there. So that's increased. And the red bar on the top is us. So we became a very significant mass of meat upon the planet. By the time you hit 1950, you're up well over 400 million tons of meat. By the time we get to 2050, we're looking at 1,450 million tons of meat strolling around the planet, almost none of which is wildlife. The vast majority are our domesticated animals. So what we've done is massively exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth for supporting vertebrate animal life, and we have dominated it by ourselves and our domesticated animals. And this, of course, continues to use up all the resources that we have on the planet, leading to increased desertification, aridification, and so forth. So we've got this enormous pressure facing us. So the way we have responded traditionally to this disappearance of nature under the pressure of us and our domesticated animals is to create national parks, is to identify really important areas of wilderness that we would preserve to hold our biodiversity. And this is a map of the biodiverse regions of Australia. And you should be pretty disappointed, really, because there's surprisingly little of this continent that we have preserved for its natural value. Remember, we're about 25 million people. We have a continent. When they were giving out continents, not many people got one. We got one, and yet we preserved relatively little. You look at the areas where there are protected landscapes, managed resources areas, national parks, they tend to be down the centre of the country through Northern Territory, South Australia, a little bit into Western Australia. You've got to be fairly disappointed with Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria when you look at this picture here. And of course, there is marine areas as well. When you look at South Australia, we've done surprisingly well. More than 30% of our state is actually given over to protected land. Now, that land might be in the care of Aboriginal people. It might be in the state parks managed system. And there's more than 360 parks, recreation parks, conservation parks, national parks that are managed by the department. And then there are large areas that are managed by not-for-government organisations, organisations like Bush Heritage, like Nature Foundation and others, and they have very extensive areas of land that they have been recovering and maintaining. So we have over 30% of our state given over to national parks to preserve species against all of that introduction that I was just saying. And it hasn't really worked very well. Despite all of our space, across Australia, 73 species have become extinct, 41 plants and 32 animals, and more than 1,000 species in South Australia are considered threatened at a state level. So we haven't necessarily been able to slow down this extinction or this extinction cliff here in Australia and here in South Australia just by creating national parks and reserves. So we need to do more. And we need to think about other ways to enhance this creation of reserves. Additionally to this, of course, our land is ruled with ferals. We know that we have lots of things like foxes and cats, goats, pigs, donkeys, camels, and also now a growing number of invertebrate pests. And then on top of that, there's some 1,500 species of plants that have invaded from overseas as well, including the notorious bufflegrass here. And these tend to get into our protected areas and can also significantly impact biodiversity in reserves. So we have further challenges. So the response really over the last 15 to 20 years is to think about how we can enhance the approach to find really high quality remnant vegetation and protect it. How do we enhance that? By re-supporting, by reinvigorating, rejuvenating so much of our landscape. And much of that has been within animals in particular, the translocation or reintroduction of populations of animals. And the reasons we've gone to translocations are listed here. Many areas have suffered local extinctions. Many of the species that have disappeared from ecosystems play a really important role in ecosystem function, and we need to reintroduce those to bring ecosystems themselves up to delivering that excellent air, water, and soils that are really important to us. By reintroducing individuals, we can increase their range and population size. We can add genetic variation into the population so that they are resistant to the challenges they face in terms of disease, pests, and climate change challenges. Many extant populations have now become so small and inbred that we need to be able to reintroduce genetic vigor into those particular populations because they have become reduced to such small numbers. We know that in many areas, species will be lost as we continue to develop and expand across the country and across the planet. But perhaps most importantly, we need to breed to reintroduce and recover these systems because we owe it to the species we share our planet with. We are not alone on this planet, and we need to start respecting the life that we share this area with. So we actually have a serious obligation to protect the life around us, not just for our own sake, but for theirs. So this idea of reintroduction, breeding, adding to the space has really led to the whole regeneration idea of recovery. So we have conservation biology, and then we have revegetation or regeneration biology that goes along with that. Rewilding started as kind of a concept within this regeneration, re-veg recovery idea. The simple definition for rewilding is to restore to its natural, uncultivated state. And that's a little bit like the definition that we started off with on biodiversity. It means something to everybody and has become an umbrella phrase for many of the things we're doing at the moment. But it didn't start that way. Rewilding actually started as a very specific concept by Sewell and Noss back in 1998. And what they thought was that you could recover wilderness by taking a three-pronged approach, particularly focusing on large carnivores. So they called it cores, corridors, and carnivores. That if you reintroduce large apex predators, they will remold an ecosystem in such a way as to give it much greater vigor and much greater capability to respond to challenge. So the argument of Sewell and Noss was that if you introduce big predators on a really large landscape scale, you will see massive recovery. And they called this rewilding. And they talked about wolves to Yellowstone. The Yellowstone to the Yukon passageway was their first great proposal. And this really took off, and we'll talk about the wolves to Yellowstone in a moment. But like all of these ideas, rewilding took off to become taken up by many other groups and organizations who had passions for other things. So other groups, and then you got Donlan there, got really enthusiastic about Pleistocene rewilding. So their view was, actually, we should try to make the Earth the way it was 13,000 years BC. So just before the Paleolithic, just before humans started establishing agriculture and settlements. To do that, you need to bring back ecological equivalence. So they were arguing, well, maybe we need rhinos in France and elephants in England, and a whole mass of challenges that brought back ecologically equivalent taxa to species that were there in that location way back 13,000 years ago. Really controversial. One group in Siberia have actually attempted this with a mixture of success. Many ecologists, of course, regard this as kind of crazy and irrelevant, and it doesn't really address the issues that we are facing right here now. But it was out there. Passive rewilding was simply to leave an area of landscape alone and see what returns. That's a little bit challenging. It works perhaps better in Europe than it does here because we're trying to retain our remnant native species and ecosystems. And passive rewilding was really popular in Europe, where many of the natural ecosystems have been gone for 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. So leaving it there is very different and is interpreted different to the way we would interpret it. And then there is translocation rewilding, which is breeding up animals elsewhere and bringing them to new locations or to locations where they used to have been and reintroducing them to add to ecosystems. And translocation rewilding is kind of where we are at here in South Australia in a number of ways. And it's important to think then about the relationship between rewilding and translocation. And in fact, there's a whole number of other processes that many of you out there will be practicing that fit into this sort of kaleidoscope, really, of concepts around rewilding. So when we're talking about rewilding, we often confuse or interact or interlocate words like translocation, reintroduction, restoration, recovery and reinforcement of populations, the creation of sanctuary colonies, or something completely different, creating novel ecosystems for ourselves or to deliver ecosystem services for ourselves and for the landscape. So the way I like to make some sense about this is to think about translocation for species conservation on the one hand, and translocation for rewilding, where rewilding is to restore natural ecosystem functional processes. So on the one hand, we want to save species for their own sake. And that could be adding a species to a range that it may still be, or it may have been there once. So you can think about adding quolls to the Flinders Ranges, for example. You have a fairly high quality environment, quolls were there, you're adding there to expand their range and build up their populations into an area where they once existed. To restore for rewilding, you're adding species that improve the ecosystem, that improve its functions, that improve its complexity, and improve its delivery of services. So you've got these two things kind of going there, and often there's overlap between those two. So if you're translocating for species conservation, you might introduce a species into an area that might already be individuals there. So you're reinforcing the population. If they're not there, you're reintroducing the population. If you're translocating for rewilding, you're reintroducing a species that might be there or might not be, but it's adding to the function of the entire ecosystem. Then you could do something slightly different. You might actually add a species to an area where it's never been before. And that's often referred to as assisted colonization. Or it could be if you're adding it just to protect itself. So you're putting a species onto an island, for example, you've got assisted colonization. If you're bringing a species into an ecosystem where that species actually replaces one that's now gone, but it serves an ecological function, then you've got ecological replacement. Okay, so you've got a lot of things going under rewilding. You're thinking about the species, you're thinking about the ecosystem, and you're thinking about whether you're supporting that species in an area it once was, or are you supporting what that species delivers into the ecosystem, or are you just helping that animal to survive? If we look at ecological restoration, we all, and most of you out there, are doing a range of different ecological restoration projects, which might incorporate rewilding. So when you think about ecological restoration, you're thinking about two choices. The first is the rehabilitation of an area. So that's usually an area that's in reasonably good condition. It might have a high level of ecological integrity before restoration. So it's over on my left hand here of the screen here. And there you can do a whole range of activities from repairing it to actually reintroducing elements that are gone, hence rewilding, to rehabilitate an ecologically valuable area. And you can think about the Flinders Ranges or the National Park at the end of York Peninsula that I've just forgotten its name of. Or you can reconstruct whole new environments that are natural, in inverted commas, but have been a recovery from an extremely damaged state. So here you might want to replicate the original system by basically starting again and improving it, or you actually replace a new ecosystem in that location using elements of the pre-existing native landscape, bringing in new landscape, and creating one that is of value to the local population and that serves ecosystem services. So when you're thinking about rewilding, you're often thinking about ecological restoration, you're thinking about rehabilitation and reconstruction, and then what's the role of introducing individual species into those sorts of landscape changes. And we're all doing that, and particularly we're doing that within the urban environment, where we're doing a lot of reconstruction and sometimes some rehabilitation. And so you can tell rehabilitation starts off with a high level of ecological integrity before restoration. The level of ecological artificiality is low. When you go to reconstruction, the level of ecological integrity is low because it's damaged or destroyed, and the artificiality of it afterwards is really high. And we'll talk about some examples of that when we come to platypus. So the whole thing about rewilding and the carnivores, corridors, and cores, finding one large location, introduce your carnivores, have them spread through corridors, excuse me, to other locations, was really illustrated by this video. And according to this, which is now a couple of years old, more than 39 million people have viewed it. It's a very romantic view about reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone, and then how they wound up changing rivers because they impacted the elk populations, which impacted the revegetation, which therefore impacted the stream banks, which impacted the river flow, which impacted the fish that came back and the beavers and a whole range of other things, and so changed the whole structure. It's a little bit romantic, and it's probably a little bit quick in my view, because I reckon they think it happened all in 15 years. But it's a really good example of what might happen over an extended period of time if you take the rewilding approach. It's worthwhile having a look at, and then a deep think about what rewilding means when you come at it from that single species approach. So rewilding really started off as those 4 different characters, but it grew into a whole lot of different approaches in different localities and became something that meant something for different communities. So rewilding was really taken up in Scotland in a number of different projects, one of which was the Caledonian forest. But here they didn't add an apex predator, they removed an apex herbivore. So they allowed the Caledonian forest to recover by removing deer, which is kind of the opposite of the original concept. But by removing deer, they removed grazing pressure, which allowed the forest to regenerate. So it's a different approach to rewilding from a species viewpoint. You can also do it with plants. So we here originally in the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges NRM board, in conjunction with the Murraylands and Rangelands board, and now the Hills and Fleurieu, have been doing the rewilding plants by bringing back paddock trees to the open grasslands. And this was the plan to introduce occasional large, or soon to become large, trees that provided habitat for birds, in particular for pardalotes, because as most of you out there know, pardalotes are really voracious insectivores and they love lerps. So by providing nesting spots for pardalotes, the pardalotes thrive. They then eat the lerps, which decrease the impact of lerps on many of the trees. And there's the bottom right-hand corner picture here shows trees being impacted by large amounts of lerps. So you can actually rewild or re-veg or reintroduce plants that have this ripple effect across the landscape. The colonisation approach for rewilding is incredibly interesting, and it's been practiced particularly in New Zealand, where they use islands, but we've been using islands here as refuges for a number of species for almost 100 years when you include Kangaroo Island and some of the other islands. So Tasmanian devils were introduced to a range of islands when the facial tumour started to take over. Sometimes that works. They did breed up. Turned out, of course, on one of the islands that they ate all the penguins there. So you've got to be very careful for managing unintended consequences. But islands have often been refuges for species. We're bringing out 35 rhinos from Africa because the chance of rhinos surviving in Africa is very limited. They might well survive here. And if we can keep the populations going here, then maybe they could be reintroduced to Africa sometime into the future. And then, of course, the social scientists have taken up a movement about rewilding ourselves. This is kind of an unusual term and reference for rewilding, but it's about connecting people with nature, and we can do it by foraging for our own food, as in this image, or living a simpler life more connected to nature. When it comes to the urban development, rewilding has become quite a popular term, and it falls really into two categories. One is, do we support and how can we support nature returning to the city anyway? Because the city provides a wide range of habitats. It provides continuous sources of water and a wide range of food and therefore opportunities. And there are some really interesting rewilding activities going on. We have corellas returning to our parklands. We have the wonderful tree martins moving into the trees of Lee Street here. And there are several thousand spend the winter here and also provide food for peregrine falcons and Australian hobbies and so forth, all within the heart of the city. These, of course, bring up some challenges for people traversing Lee Street and Peel Street, but at the same time, nature is finding a way to share the space with us. And then, of course, you've got the deliberate recovery programs that we are implementing at the moment. The River Torrens is a great example, Carrawirra Parry, where we destroyed it in the 1800s. I mean, really, it was a spectacular effort to manage to turn a functioning ecosystem and a really important one for biodiversity into one that had very little value by the start of the 20th century. And you can see here an image of Talia Woodley, Park 27, just near Benithan Park. And in the 1800s, a huge amount of work was put in there in the early 2000s. It was the first of the major regeneration areas in a particular location and was part of the whole reconstruction of the Torrens that started in the 1960s with a flood mitigation strategy, the creation of the parkway, the bikeway and the amenity trails and so forth, and still continues. So here with the Carrawirra Parry River Torrens, we are rejuvenating the sites and recovering the area. And this is where the Platypus project becomes a really interesting aspect when you think about rewilding. So on the one hand, it fits that definition. We are taking an apex predator, the platypus is a predator, and we're bringing it back to see how it will shape and mold the ecosystem. But we're also bringing it into an ecosystem where we have been rehabilitating areas that are not so badly damaged, the areas upstream, and those that have been completely reconstructed and reorganized from an incredibly degraded area. So it kind of overlaps all of these particular areas. It is a translocation because platypus were here in the 1800s, so we're returning it to its area of part of its traditional range, and it enables us to have new populations of platypus, which may be able to support platypus populations across the country. And then hopefully we'll be able to reconnect it to other areas over time. So you can see that the various aspects and the new ways of thinking about rewilding kind of all fit in under the umbrella of a platypus. It is about ecosystem services because it's about creating the Torrens Carrawirra Parry as a functioning ecosystem that delivers ecosystem services. And it's about the platypus, and it's about all of the other animals and plants that are necessary for creating that system to survive and thrive. So it's a really cool project, and it's really interesting in that it kind of encapsulates all of where we are at with rewilding. Perhaps to me, the most exciting aspect of this project is its connection with people. So hence the comment and the rather strange picture about rewilding ourselves. We need to be connecting with nature, and we need to be understanding nature and becoming part of it and championing it in our own backyard in order to deal with the issues that biodiversity faces elsewhere across the state, the country, and the planet. So there's been a number of successes with rewilding. Most famously, the Pierre David deer, which was a population of deer found in China that were eventually restricted to just the gardens of the Imperial Palace in China in the late 18th century, early 19th century. With the revolutions that occurred there in the start of the 20th century, they were all killed. But fortunately, a few animals wound up in the estates of very wealthy people in the UK and France. And from there, the animals were bred up and have been reintroduced to China 100 years later. Przewalski's horse was another one. Populations here in South Australia were reintroduced to Mongolia where they were extinct. And of course, Tama wallabies were reintroduced into Innes National Park on York Peninsula from populations in New Zealand. And this has been a really important role for the future of zoos. Zoos now have embraced rewilding because they can breed up populations that can be reintroduced. And New Zealand's been at the forefront of this, with most of its zoos developing really important populations of birds, tuatara and elsewhere, introducing them onto islands initially and then back onto the mainland. But there are a lot of problems, and I'm going to summarise now with just a quick cook's tour about being careful with rewilding. One is, what are you introducing? If you want to introduce a large carnivore like lynx into the UK here, a lot of people don't want that because they see their pets being killed by a large feline carnivore. The dams of the UK and Europe have been affected by beavers, or dams made by beavers, that can cause a lot of damage to private property. We have a lot of issues with urban rewilding. There are now wolves in towns in Germany. A lot of people don't like eastern brown snakes in their backyards. Go figure, but they don't, even though they keep down mice numbers. And of course, animals change their own behaviours once they're introduced into urban environments. And I particularly like this picture of corellas on a really cold morning working out where the warmest spot is. And it is, of course, the red traffic lights. So they don't care what's happening down below when people can't see the traffic lights because they're nice and toasty warm. So animals change their behaviour. We're also looking at projects where you can recover ancient species by using DNA techniques to bring back the thylacine or mammoths. Where do you put them? And what do you do with new species that haven't been around for hundreds or thousands of years? And of course, the last big issue is that to create the big spaces of land required for the carnivores, cores and corridors approach, you need to move people off land. And there's a lot of ethical issues and strong moral issues about whether you can replace farmers or communities in order to return land to a natural situation. And there's a lot of conflict across the world about whether such an activity is ethical or not. And the final point is communication. One of the big stories here about as we embrace rewilding is that a lot of people won't be part of it and won't want to be part of it, and often make, in this case, a humorous, but often a real set of criticisms about reintroducing animals. I particularly like Whistlecrock, the Serbian Christmas bird, because it's a story from Serbia about naughty children. And if your children are bad, then the Whistlecrock will come, take your child away and eat it in its mountain eyrie. And there was this picture here developed in 1909 showing a child, a naughty child, being taken away by Whistlecrock. And it was claimed to be an authentic picture, although clearly you can see it's totally fake. It's a vulture, of course. The child and vulture are in focus, as is in the background, so it's obviously doctored. But this picture was adapted by the Scottish farmers who didn't want white-tailed sea eagles introduced into Scotland. So they argued it also would take away your children, and used very similar images and gained a lot of support for the fear of eagles, and therefore they shouldn't be introduced. So there's a lot of importance around how we set up these messages around these reintroductions. In fact, probably Haas eagle of New Zealand, which is extinct, and maybe a couple of others, Harpies eagles, and possibly wedgies might have taken very small children, but there's very little evidence that eagles ever take your babies. So really quickly, I just wanted to put up here a SWOT analysis that I'd like everyone there to think about when they're thinking about your own rewilding project. So there are strengths: species recovery, citizen science, community engagement, creating good news stories, generate optimism, lots of success stories. They are experiential and engaging, potentially large scale. They help to create biophilic cities, and they improve the microbiome. And you can run through a list like that to see what your project is doing as a supporting activity. Weaknesses of rewilding: there can be unintended consequences. Too many koalas in the Adelaide Hills is a good example. Dispossessed people and economic hardship is real, and there's a number of issues around the world in that space. Creating novel ecosystems in the wrong places can actually devalue ecosystem services elsewhere, particularly in the marine environment. There are costs. There are the time span for effect, which can be decades. We can overpromise and underdeliver. There's issues around succession versus replacement that I don't have time to go into for vegetation assemblages. The genetics of populations and making sure they are robust and as broad as possible. Behavior changes do occur in animals, and that can then upset what you're trying to achieve. There's the risk of disease introduction, and then the selection of why and what are you doing? Are you doing it for the species? You're doing it for the ecosystem services. And then the requirement for continuous monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and improvement. Opportunities lie in increasing ecosystem complexity. There's lots of species to choose from, and it's highly engaging for the public. There's a really important role for zoos and a range of breeding institutions, some of which can be quite informal and involve societies. Educational, aspirational, marine, the response to climate change, and interconnection with people are all enormous opportunities. Threats? It's not a replacement for management. So passive rewilding, particularly in a place like Australia and South Australia, doesn't work. We need to continue to manage. It is not a replacement for retaining natural environments. They are and always will be the #1 approach for conservation. If you take just the species approach, it's not an ecosystem approach and is very dangerous because you can over-focus on the species and forget about the bigger picture. And we tend to over-focus on charismatic species that may not necessarily be the keystone species. Lack of expertise in the area, though South Australia now has done a lot of rewilding projects and has a lot of expertise, probably leads the country really in its rewilding activities, can be disorganised, and of course you could choose the wrong species. Don't get me started on koalas. So the future of conservation and survival science, which is taking a multi-dimensional approach to saving species. There's too many here to go through, but they involve all of the activities that we're talking about: preserving remnant vegetation, revegetation, rewilding, connections and corridors, translocations, whether they be self-directed, climate change or human-induced, creating sanctuary populations, even more research, identifying the keystone and iconic species, not necessarily the same thing, continually managing populations as they increase and decrease, genetic rescue and expanding the genetics of populations, managing disease and parasitism, identifying the threats such as climate change, pests and competitors, and most importantly, engaging people. So with that, I will conclude with the fact that the future's rich in terms of rewilding, however you wish to define it, and whatever role you wish to take within it. There's so much to do, and it's really quite exciting now that we take this large-scale, multi-dimensional approach to bringing back and recovering ecosystems. We always have to focus on those magnificent remnant areas and protect them with everything that we can. And we can do everything we can to improve our local backyard, degraded other areas, our marine environments, and so forth. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.
I think you're just on mute, Nat.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got quite a few questions that have come through, so let's get stuck into them while we've got the time. Bron has asked, how can we find out about information to rewild our backyards? So I will take this opportunity to let everyone know that we are redeveloping our wildlife-friendly backyards resource, a range of fact sheets, and we will be looking at some community education opportunities in this space, but I'm sure you've got comments and things to share on your perspectives of rewilding our backyards and our home and private yards. Is there anything you'd like to say to that, Chris?
Look, there is so much going on, and there's a number of ways that we can think about our backyards. You can think about your very own backyard, which means that you can put in native trees, shrubs, a water dish, and so forth. So you can think about creating some little habitat. Next step, talk to your neighbours. The more you intellect and interconnect little bits, the better it will be, and you create corridors. There's a magnificent program of wonderful people in the Stirling area who've created corridors for bandicoots. And then, of course, you join your local group that might look at a street, a park, a suburb, and then you work in that particular space. Green Adelaide supports more than 100 different groups across the metropolitan area. And all of that makes a difference because the Adelaide metropolitan area is part of the biodiversity zone, the biodiversity hotspot, that is the Mount Lofty's Adelaide Kangaroo Island region. It's the only biodiversity hotspot we have in the state and one of only 15 in the country. You want to make an impact on conserving biodiversity, the spot to do it is right here. So there's all these different ways of tackling those issues. So I strongly encourage people to start off going to the website, and then from there, find a Friends of group or a local group, or start your own street group. And then you can apply for funding and become connected to the greater groups. Many of the local governments, of course, have excellent staff here who are willing to help in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, Ethan has asked about introducing more venomous snakes to the Adelaide metro region. I can only assume this is about maybe managing some of the feral pests and things that we have, but I'm sure this is more of a controversial one, but I thought it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that, Chris.
Look, it really is, and I'm a herpetologist, and I suspect Ethan may have heard me talk at various other spots where I do like to humorously comment that we need to bring death adders back, of course, because they were here. There is a whole mass of issues about introducing animals that can potentially harm human populations. So whether you do that deliberately or whether you simply provide areas where they can come and occupy, and then you warn and educate communities. We already have quite a lot of venomous snakes in Adelaide, particularly eastern browns, where they do a surprisingly good job at keeping down mice numbers. People don't come in contact with them very often, and that's probably a good thing because they are in the top handful of most venomous snakes across the world. Usually when people come in contact with them and get bitten, in many cases, it's the fault of some rather silly behavior of the individuals concerned. So I don't think you'd probably look at animals that are potentially harmful to people. You do wind up with the wolves in the villages in Germany type issue in that case. We've got plenty of other animals that can impact ecosystems that aren't harmful and often are really enjoyable for people. So I talked about platypus, ricali are another one, the Australian otter that's really important. Many bird species are really valuable and people really enjoy them. And so I probably would be focusing on those first, even if Ethan is probably having a bit of a lend of me.
Thanks, Chris. We have a question from Ryan asking about where the platypus will be introduced. And this also goes in line whether it's going to be upstream or downstream of the Torrens Weir. And someone else asked a question that I think is connected. Will there be stronger water quality targets for stormwater discharging to the Torrens in an effort to protect the platypus?
So taking the second question first, the preliminary studies that we have done, or the excellent studies we've done, rather than just saying they're preliminary, show the water quality is fine at the moment because it's supporting large amounts of invertebrates. So the platypus is a mammal, so it just needs to have lots of food. If the water quality is fine to support all the little bugs, you know, the mayflies and the stoneflies and the caddisflies, the yabbies, the prawns, all those sorts of things, it's really happy. So it exists in all sorts of polluted streams in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. Our water quality is good enough to support a wide variety and large number of invertebrates. So it's got the prey. That doesn't mean we don't keep continually improving the water quality. The most important aspect for us is plastic pollution, because that does knock about platypus and ricali and ducks and tortoises and a range of other wildlife. So continually removing those large pieces of pollution is the most important role for us. So that's where we're really focusing now, and we'll always continue to monitor water quality by monitoring the bugs. Where they go is really interesting. The Torrens is 85 kilometres long and has 6 major tributaries, which are also quite long, particularly when you look at 6th and 5th creeks. And many of those have excellent areas that run through parkland already, so are pretty much ready to go. As you come down through Campbelltown, through Felixstowe, down into Walkerville, much of that area has been dramatically improved. So there are sites there that are potentially release sites. The Torrens Lake, 400 meters or so is a little bit more problematic because of the weir and the way that it has tended to focus much of the material. And then downstream from the weir, there's been an enormous amount of improvement. So Breakout Creek stages 1 to 3, the Tullia Woodley areas, a lot of the area has really been improved. So I think eventually we would see platypus introduced into 1, 2, 3 sites. Not sure exactly where yet. Our ecologists are working on that. And then we would expect them to spread across most, if not all, of their range. We know that we want a waterway of at least 50 kilometres long to support a viable, sustainable population of platypus. We've got 85 kilometres in the Torrens and substantial amounts in the tributaries. They also should then be able to distribute themselves to the Onkaparinga, to the Sturt River, to a range of other creeks, particularly through the hills. So we would expect to see, if this works well, platypus should eventually, over the next 100 years, move across the entire range of the Mount Lofties, or at least that's my dream.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Okay, we've had a couple of questions about cats, and I guess, do you have anything that you'd like to share on how we can be stricter in our council rules on domestic cats? I guess this is an example of an requiring an interdisciplinary approach.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to share on that?
So cats are a real challenge, because we mustn't demonize cats, because people love cats, and cats are the second most popular pet after dogs, and I think they just come in ahead of budgies and canaries. So people love them. And there are 3 groups of cats, and we often mix them all up. There is the domestic cat that's well looked after, that's often kept in home, that's well managed by their family and owners. Then there are the semi-owned cats, and these are the really problematic ones, the ones that roam extensively, that might be fed by a number of people, that pop up, that also become very adept at taking wildlife, and then wind up having kittens in people's sheds and so forth. And from there, the semi-owned cats move into the feral cats, which are the really significant problems. I'm on the board of the RSPCA, and we estimate there's about 140,000 semi-owned cats. So most of the target now is about how we improve the management of semi-owned so they don't become feral. Also, responsible cat management is becoming really a big thing now for people who do look after their cats well. And they're introducing cat runs, keeping cats indoors at night, belling cats, desexing cats is incredibly important, and microchipping them. So we find that there is a growing proportion of the population that are managing their cats well. So the focus now will shift on those semi-owned cats, desexing them, catching them, managing them, trying to return them either to care or to fostering them out, and then, of course, to eliminating as much as we can the feral cat populations, not just within the city, but across the state.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So Ethan has asked, how can we achieve large-scale rewilding projects in Adelaide when such a large proportion of land is residential? We can create corridors along waterways and transport corridors, but habitats will always be fragmented. Should there be more onus on property owners to rewild their land?
I think there should be more education for property owners to know the value of their backyards for wildlife. It is improving. And when I first started off on urban ecology way back in the very early 2000s, people just did not think it was important, that they should even think about their backyards in terms of supporting habitat for eastern spinebills, for New Holland honeyeaters, for magpies, for a lot of those animals that we really like, eastern rosellas, Adelaide rosellas, blue tongues. Now they actually recognise that, in fact, sharing their space with them, if they're lucky enough to have a backyard, is really important. So people with backyards are starting to value it more. They also hate other wildlife as well. You know, there's a lot of hatred of noisy miners, of corellas, of too many pigeons. They also hate people who indiscriminately feed some birds, so you wind up with large flocks. So a lot of it's about education and explaining that delicate balance. Now we're also seeing the disappearance of the backyard as those traditional Adelaide houses are sold off. Instead of one house in a front yard and a backyard, you've got 3 or 4. So a lot of it is about working with councils to make sure there is open space, and that open space has value for nature. So I think we need to continue the education program, and organisations like Green Adelaide and environmental officers in local government have really important roles to play in encouraging people and communities to engage with nature in their own space. Yes, it's going to be fragmented and it's going to be artificial, but of course there's opportunity there too. Cities have lots of introduced plants that are used by birds. Red hot pokers are used by a wide range of honey eaters. Eastern spinebills love agapanthus, a weed of national significance, but it provides resources for these particular birds. So there's a lot of opportunities here to support. Managing cats and keeping foxes away is really important because you decrease the predator load. Managing your dog outside is really important because they will chase possums and koalas and others. We live an extraordinary life here in Adelaide because we have so much life around us. Many of the people on this webinar will have travelled extensively around Europe and not seen anything. You go to France and it's silent. You go to China and it's silent. You come here and you can't hear yourself think half an hour before dawn because of all the birds carrying on. We are incredibly lucky, and we need to preserve this incredible advantage for succeeding generations.
Fantastic. All right, I think we've got time for one last question. So Alex has asked, how can we introduce native herbivores to urban areas, in addition, of course, to containing cats?
Yeah, now that's a great question, because there were quite a number of really important herbivores here before European colonisation. There were two types of bettong, for example. There was the bilby. Pinky Flat is named, of course, after the bilby. And these animals were really, really common, disappeared really, really, really fast. It's interesting that rabbits seem to make it surprisingly well in urban or peri-urban areas, and particularly in smaller communities along the coast. So there is the possibility. The big challenge for that is foxes, followed then by really good hunting dogs like Jack Russells and Fox Terriers. Cats, for those animals, cats are less of an issue. Cats tend to take out birds and reptiles rather than those small, medium-sized mammals. Our biggest problems with those remain, how do we manage foxes? So there's a lot of effort into managing foxes, particularly associated with the seabird colonies on Bird Island, on Torrens Island, and now in the International Bird Sanctuary. Keeping them out there is our #1 priority, probably before we could introduce wild populations of bettongs or bilbies, sadly. Interestingly, the bush rat and the swamp rat are doing quite well on the Fleurieu at the moment. So I think some of these animals are starting to learn to live with predators. And so I've got some hope there that Rattus fuscipes and Rattus lutriolus, our rats, will do as well as the introduced rats.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. So just to finish up, I know that you have written a huge number of award-winning books. I know you didn't realize I was going to throw this at you at the end, but look, I think it's excellent, the literature that you have produced. And is there any particular books, whether they're ones you've written or other people, for people that would like to learn more in this space? I can send links to them, but is there anything you'd like to share for where people can learn more and continue this rewilding journey?
Well, look, my absolute favourite book, I guess probably was the first one I did because it was a massive learning journey for me, and that's Adelaide Nature of a City. And that had contributions from some 70 incredible leaders in ecology in the city. Really wonderful people, and I learned so much about urban ecology from that book. It wound up selling almost 8,000 copies for a local book. So I really loved that one. There's the Guide to Urban Wildlife that we did with HarperCollins, which actually has the stories of animals that you do find in your backyard. James Smith's book, The Wildlife of Greater Adelaide, is outstanding and should be on everybody's bookshelf. He was a brilliant author and a really great guide to what should happen here. People are making suggestions of books. Darryl Cranball's book of the pre-European vegetation of Adelaide is fantastic. There's a number of great plant books. I really love It's Blue with 5 Petals, which is, I think, still in print, or a second edition has just come out, and the Botanic Gardens have produced a number of great books. We are actually pretty lucky in that we've got really dynamic people. Neville Bonney's just produced a new book on seeds. I would really suggest developing a library, because we've got people like Neville Bonney and Anne Prescott, Darryl Cranball, James Smith, who've gone to the effort of producing local relevant texts that are incredibly valuable. So I would urge everyone out there to pop down to Imprints and Dymocks and get a good collection.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'll follow up next week with a link to the recording of this session and all our previous sessions, as well as links to the books and the resources that have been discussed today. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much.